introduced. It's an honor to be introduced by friends and colleagues and to be back virtually at least at home in the department where I earned my own PhD and where I still think of as one of my academic homes. And I want to thank Greg and Jarue for the kind introductions and Pietro for the work happening as well today, and also acknowledge this talk was supposed to happen at the end of last year, and to acknowledge Ariason as well. As a student, I participated in organizing the Colloquium series, so I hope I have some insight into the kind of deep work and the honor it is to be a part of this conversation. Before I jump into my own talk, I also want to thank there are many friends and colleagues in the room, and this project, which began as my dissertation, would of course not have been possible without some of the folks here in the Department of Information Studies, including Michelle and Jonathan in particular. I also want to, I know we may be in many different virtual spaces, but I want to acknowledge two at least, and I hope you can take a moment to do so in the places where you physically are as well. But here in Seattle, I want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Coast Salish people, and these are borrowed lands on which I stand, land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And I want to pay respect to the elders, past and present, as well as the living descendants and the future generations of the Coast Salish. And again, I hope that you'll join me in honoring the people of the places in which you are located. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if you have, I know, hopefully this will be a smooth technological process, but if there are ever any issues hearing or seeing anything, feel free to jump in and interrupt me, and I look forward to having a conversation at the end of my talk today. So let me go ahead and share my slides with you here. And again, thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here. On this page of the Archive Project Zine titled The Eternal Question, its creator, Frank Moore, a painter and Visual Aids Archive Project co-founder, queries, has anyone seen my AZT, DAT, DDI, DDC, excuse me, 3TC, QBC. This litany of pharmaceutical acronyms is a concise chronology of FDA-approved pharmaceuticals for treating people living with HIV and AIDS. Beginning with AZT at the top of that list in 1987, each of these new medications, despite high initial hopes, proved to have limited efficacy and its own set of nasty side effects. Failed almost universally before the development of a combination of antiretroviral drugs in late 1995, the same year that Moore drew up this list here. With characteristic wit, he ends with QVC, the televised home shopping network being the only viable remedy left. In the face of what were unremittingly grave conditions, Moore's Archive Project co-founder, the art critic and writer David Hirsch, told me in an interview, quote, "We had to invent our own hope," end quote. I begin here with this story about HIV and incurability so that we can begin to think about the significance of cure in a sense beyond just medical cure in ways I'll get to in a moment. In today's talk, I want to first introduce my book in progress for now, at least titled Viral Cultures, Activist Archiving in the Age of AIDS. I want to address too briefly some of the stakes of critically examining AIDS records and archives, as well as the people and the systems that generate, collect, care for them, and the ways that they are activated by activists, artists, curators, and archivists, and why these records and these archives merit a critical examination at this particular pandemic conjuncture. I will then focus for the remainder of my talk on what will be the third chapter of my book project, titled An Archival Cure, Remedy, Care, and Curation with the Visual AIDS Archive Project. In this particular chapter, I analyzed the founding and the development of one community-based AIDS archive at Visual AIDS, a New York City-based community arts organization that was founded in 1988 and that continues to produce artworks, exhibitions, and events in order to facilitate both reflection and action on HIV/AIDS. And as a community archive, they document and collect the work and the lives of HIV-positive artists. And they began this work in the early 90s and continue it to the present. For Visual AIDS, their enactment of a vision for an archive for the community of HIV-positive artists is a form of cure for HIV/AIDS, a condition that remains medically incurable, though we are more than 4 decades into a global pandemic. In this chapter, I draw on literature in particular from disability studies and critical HIV studies to situate the archives within cure ideology in ways I'll talk about in a few minutes. But first, for a bit more context, my book, Viral Cultures, follows the cultural life of records created by and about HIV/AIDS and the activism that was generated in response to it during the 1980s and early 1990s. And it follows those records and archives, and particularly the records as they move into, within, and beyond the constraints of the AIDS archives. And it looks particularly at how they circulate and how they are remediated in the spaces of archival exhibitions and digital media. Because I know we arrive at this talk and at this day from a variety of backgrounds and entry points, I want to just give a bit of brief context here for HIV/AIDS as well and its activism. HIV was circulating through social and sexual networks in the 1960s and 1970s in North America, though it was not until 1981 that the US medical community identified clusters of what they referred to as, quote, homosexual men, who were diagnosed with a set of previously rare opportunistic infections. This gave rise to a toxic mixture of paranoia and scientific ignorance about the retrovirus's cause and means of infection, one that we can perhaps see some resonances now, living amidst 2 pandemics. And this kind of ignorance and paranoia created a widespread panic about AIDS in the United States. Politicians and the media amplified these characteristics, leading to a widespread discrimination, stigma, violence, and a kind of inaction that contributed to the rise of what is still an ongoing and a global pandemic. In the early 1980s, in the face of widespread and far-reaching neglect, stigma, and discrimination, and as death counts rapidly rose, gay and lesbian communities organized in response. And by 1986, we see oppositional groups emerging that argue that confrontational direct action is the only way forward. ACT UP is perhaps the most well-known of these groups, and it was formed in New York City in 1987 and quickly expanded. But activist groups came to intervene in nearly every aspect of the AIDS crisis with tremendous effect, and they still do. I also want to emphasize that we are right now living in 2 pandemics, and to give some context for the current AIDS pandemic. Currently, globally, approximately 37 million people are living with HIV or AIDS. 35 million people have died. And in the United States, as of 2017, approximately 1.2 million people were living with HIV. 38,000 new infections take place every year, and an estimated 660,000 people have already died. And I also want to make it clear here, right, that new infections, suffering, and death, and a lack of access to healthcare and resources as we again perhaps see resonances in this moment with another pandemic, remain starkly unequal across lines of race, gender, class, ability, carceral and immigration statuses, to name a few. And I want to emphasize too that archiving is a vital component of current AIDS cultural activism. Such knowledge would otherwise be marginalized, suppressed, or maybe even forgotten altogether. Despite widespread acknowledgement in productions that range from scholarly books to popular films to exhibitions of the significance of early AIDS activism, and particularly the archive, right? All of that work depends heavily on the archives I'm talking about today. However, those archives themselves have not gotten adequate attention previously, and so my project is in part to investigate them with depth and rigor. So my book offers an account of the people, particularly the activists, the artists, the curators, and the archivists, as well as the ideologies, whether temporal, political, cultural, or biomedical, that created and shape AIDS archives and cultural productions, including exhibition, artwork, and digital remediations in ways that animate those records in powerful ways. And this project is an archival ethnography, which means it's based on a series of semi-structured interviews, participant observation, archival research, and document analysis within a network of archival collections and collaborations between activists, archivists, artists, and curators. And for those who are less familiar, though I know many people in this room have used or are thinking about using this kind of methodology, archival ethnography names a type of naturalistic interpretivist inquiry, which is done in order to gain an understanding of the perspective of those who care, collect, create, and use records. It allows for the analysis of the social, cultural, political, aesthetic, and technological dimensions of records, as well as the systems that produce and maintain them, and the ways that they are used and reused. And my larger project looks at three different sites, and I draw on case studies from each of those. And there are three prominent AIDS archives seen here, including the New York Public Library's Manuscripts and Archives Division, the New York University's Fales Library and Special Collections, and Visual AIDS, which, as I mentioned, is a community-based arts organization committed to raising AIDS awareness through visual art, assisting artists living with HIV, and by preserving artists' legacies. And the book is structured into 5 chapters. And for those of you who are doctoral students or in the process of thinking about how to transition projects, I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A as well. But each of the kind of content chapters centers on a case or a series of intertwined cases. Some chapters, like the one I'm going to share with you today, zoom in on a single archives or even an object or event, while others reach across archival institutions, collections, and decades. The book grapples and grows along with the epidemic's own evolution. It's quite intentional that it addresses, but that it does not end with cure. We are still living in a particularly kind of paradoxical moment of presumed HIV survivability with better drugs, of projected epidemic endpoints, and yet of also unrelenting devastation. In its structure, the book hopes to highlight some of the enduring importance and the presence of the AIDS past to and in its present and for its future. And this project contributes to our larger knowledge about activist archiving, the various activities in which archivists, very broadly defined, mobilize their archival collections to support activism for social justice, and to archiving activism, the collection and maintenance of activist records in archives. In the book, I argue that how we actually engage with those AIDS archives dictates more than just the AIDS past. AIDS archives shape possible presents and futures and the distributions of life chances in them. Records hold the power when harnessed by activists, artists, curators, and archivists through vital nostalgia to be mobilized as forces that can repoliticize AIDS and reinvest AIDS time with palpable urgency. Vital nostalgia, the larger analytic inaugurated in this book project, is a generative practice for interrogating, for addressing, and for, I hope, repairing structural power inequities that's grounded in nostalgia, a bittersweet longing for a past time or space. Vital nostalgia then names the critical examination of the present through its ongoing relationship to the past. And the temporal and affective drag that happens here of holding on to that past is about its political potentiality for feeling, for imagining, and for enacting a different, more just present and future. When activated through processes of vital nostalgia, AIDS archives can showcase how activists and how people living with HIV/AIDS are coping, struggling, and even thriving, not as the epidemic ends, but rather as it continues to just unfold and evolve. And archives have a really powerful and important role to play in developing a holistic, complex cultural response to HIV/AIDS, in stemming further suffering and death, and to improving life chances and quality for those who are continually marginalized. In other words, archives have an important role to play in developing a more holistic sense of cure. Returning here to Frank Moore's archive project, Zine, he expands his analysis of medical cures that were attempted for HIV/AIDS by 1995 when he created this zine. He divvies up the 1990s by different treatment protocols. 1990, for example, 3 pills and no more alcohol. And finally, by 1995, a veritable handful of capsules he labels toxic, doesn't work, hair falls out, poison. To talk critically about cure, I'm going to frame cure drawing on the work from scholars and activists in disability studies and critical HIV studies, and at the points of convergence between those literatures. Despite real divergences in what is understood as an HIV/AIDS cure and how it is to be accomplished, cure and the processes that work towards it are central to the efforts and the aspirations of various anti-AIDS constituencies, including people living with HIV/AIDS, AIDS activists, medical researchers and physicians, public health officials, and governments and NGOs. Whether as a noun or as a verb, in the late capitalist United States, when we talk about cure, it inevitably refers to a restoration of health, the eradication of illness, and the removal of disability through medical treatment. In other words, what we actually mean is medical cure. Cure then signals the outright and enduring elimination of impairment, but also encompasses the normalizing treatments, the curative processes, the work that assimilates the disabled body, the ill body or mind into normative society. It's embedded then in ways disability theorists have illustrated for us in structures of diagnosis, treatment, management, rehabilitation, and prevention. Centered on eradication, I want to emphasize too that cure can operate in tandem with violence. Scholarly and activist critiques that challenge cure as part of a larger challenging of the medical model of disability that sees it as an individual pathology that can and should be corrected through professional interventions. I also want to be clear that today there is no HIV/AIDS cure, just even in a medical sense, right? Just more and better treatment protocols for those who want and who have the access uh, to the resources that are required to adhere to them. Even if one day an all out cure for HIV/AIDS is achieved, whether a vaccine, a drug, or another technology yet to be imagined, it would not be wholly eradicated. Cure carries always the memory of disability. It does not erase formative experience. Moreover, as disability theorist Yoonjin Kim concludes, cure often does not eliminate the stigma associated with a history of disability and illness. As the case I examine in this particular chapter and in my talk today will show, a holistic cure for the ills that trouble HIV positive bodies includes activist archiving. From the start, visual aids has worked through practices of vital nostalgia, whether remedy, care, or curing, to engender a more holistic HIV/AIDS cure, one that encompasses but reaches far beyond the boundaries of medical cure. It was not yet apparent in 1996, when Executive Director Nick Debs wrote these words, that that would be the year when combination therapies would both prove more effective and would become widely available on the American market. Yet already in that moment, visual aids is emphasizing that by cure, we do not mean a medicine that will stop the mechanism of HIV/AIDS in the human body. We mean a cure for the human impulses, which cause the evisceration of social service agencies for those living with AIDS, the censoring of life by the religious right and the theory-driven left, and the material impoverishment of the majority of humankind. And Debs powerfully concludes here, right, what we actually need a cure for, what we mean a cure for, is of cruelty and fear. As I will demonstrate today, the archival cure they advanced through vital nostalgia not only acknowledged the disparities in the distribution of crises, but engendered a process of addressing and redressing harms from stigma to discrimination. The holistic cure that visual aids imagined then and worked towards is essential to responding to an epidemic that is political, cultural, as much as biomedical. The Archive project highlights that when done through vital nostalgia, activist archiving can have material and conceptual affordances, particularly in its imaginative capacities, to vitally challenge hatred, discrimination, and stigmatization that are born of structural oppression and fear. And I want to talk in three different ways about the kind of archival cure that's offered here. And these three different ways are informed by cure's own multiplicity. First, cure as a kind of remedy for death. Second, as acts of critical care. And third, as curing that enables a kind of long-term survival. And I'll break each of those down a bit further in a moment. In the first understanding of cure I want to explore today, I turn to the founding and early development of the Archive project and its counterpart, the Artist Plus Registry, as a remedy for the kind of unbearable loss in the form of day-to-day and individualized stopgap measures. It offered an antidote for a particular form of a particular kind of death. It offered a kind of resolution that I'll talk about in a moment. The archives generated then a much needed hope for artists that their work could and would survive. And that's particularly important in this context in 1994 and 1995, a time when, though it's far from perfect now, medicine offered even less. Returning here to the zine, on the mindfill/landfill page you see before you, Moore renders a trash can complete with rat. Labeled Life's Work. In 1994 and 1995, the Archive project was concerned that for artists living with HIV, two kinds of death were imminent. First, that of the physical body, and second, that of the artistic practice and career. And a toxic combination of health and financial issues meant that many artists did slow or stop creating work altogether. In 1994, Moore called on Hirsch and asked if he would, quote, like to start an archive of slides by artists who have died or who have HIV/AIDS, end quote. And this moment in 1994 and 1995 is often called by scholars and by activists alike the deepest, darkest point in the kind of American AIDS crisis. It's estimated that 13% of New York City's artists were living with HIV/AIDS by that point. And activists had been working already for a long decade in which progress, where it occurred, was often incremental and riddled with doubt, and where forces of ignorance and apathy seemed often to gain an upper hand. There was also increasing knowledge in this moment of the epidemic's tremendous breadth and depth, and these conditions, right, created what Moore described as despair and desperation. To the Archive Committee's first meeting at his Soho loft, he and Hirsch invited a set of artists, curators, and other cultural workers. These early members of the Archive project were drawn largely from the networks of two white, gay, cisgendered professional men who were deeply enmeshed in Manhattan's art scene, and it meant that the other members of these committees often mirrored those identities in important ways. Visual aids and the archive committee would together form the archive project in fall of 1994, and it became quickly the driving directive for the organization, a position it still holds today. Generating and collecting photographic documentation of artworks was the primary fix they could offer. Hirsch would play matchmaker. He paired artists and volunteer photographers who would then go to an artist's studio and photograph their work. Visual aids would provide a set of slides for the artist and keep a copy for the archives. And it's important here to think about kind of the technological context of the early 1990s, when documentation was very expensive and something typically covered by galleries for their artists. Therefore, the possibilities of loss of work altogether were most acute for those artists who had not received any kind of art world recognition, a group more likely to include women, people of color, and outsider artists. Within the project's first year, 75 artists had their artworks documented and their slides donated along with other records to the archives. And it's important to acknowledge, right, that there are inherent and material limitations and failures to this kind of remedy that the archive project could provide in the face of HIV/AIDS rapid and unrelenting devastation. Some members had hoped to offer a permanent exhibition spaces, storage spaces for artworks, to do video interviews with each artist. These plans never came to fruition. Not all artists wanted to be or could be reached in time, and the difficult and sometimes unachievable challenges of working against the clock, maintaining momentum, sustaining funding, and just surviving took a real toll. On this page of the zine, which unfortunately is cut off at the top, it reads, "The Archive," more depicts the stacks. Archiving the dead's remains, as more concisely sums up here, sucks. If always limited in scope, scale, and thereby impact, the Archives project's archival cure nonetheless ensured that there actually would be a record, grounded in the political commitments of vital nostalgia, a deep attunement to power and to the importance of the AIDS past in dictating its present and future. The Archives created a new and an urgently needed remedy, one that was generated by, for, and with its community, easing some of the hopelessness and fear about the demise, at least, of one's artwork and one's legacy, proffering a much needed hope and thereby a measure of cure. In the second sense of cure I want to talk about today, I want to examine acts of critical caring and caretaking in the archives as a kind of cure practice. Activist archiving at Visual Aids was always motivated and is motivated by communal care. And care is a structural response. The archives highlights how the lives of artists living with HIV/AIDS matter, and its content can provide insight, perhaps, into how to best care for people emotionally, physically, and financially as well. AIDS introduced me to a world of constant need, of constant care, Hirsch emphasized to me in an interview. Unable, despite their best efforts, to ameliorate or resolve embodied experiences of pain or to stem the parade of death, the Archive Project was a form of critical care that members could actually offer to their own community of HIV-positive artists. The experiences of photographer John Dugdale, seen here being interviewed by David Hirsch and photographed by another early artist member, Eric Rain, uh, kind of point to how the archives formulated care in these early days. Dugdale was an HIV positive man and an honorary member of the archives committee. And in the early 1990s, his vision was deteriorating. Yet with assistance, he was able to continue to make and to show his photographs. Through the archives, Visual Aids cadre of activists, archivists work to extend the reach of care through processes of documentation and by engendering artistic exposure to other artists living with HIV/AIDS. Eventually, they would come to focus especially on serving HIV-positive women, trans people, people of color, and other artists who are excluded from more traditional archival spaces. With material and affective support, they hoped these artists might be able to continue to work and to live. Given its cultural deficits in glamour, emphasis on interdependence, and inherent failures in the face of resolution imperatives, care does often not get its kind of full due in accounts of AIDS activism and perhaps in accounts of archives as well. Yet, it was care that actually enabled community members here the capacity to resist and to withstand HIV/AIDS. And there are two parameters here for placing records in the archive's care that were established from the start and remain the same today. The archives collects the records of anyone who self-identifies first as an artist and second as HIV positive. The latter requires also implicitly an ability and a willingness to disclose one's serostatus in a publicly accessible archives. What began as caretaking confined within a very intimate network of lovers, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances evolved quickly into a more prodigious communal orientation. Wanted Dead or Alive reads Roberto Juarez's 1995 recruitment poster, playing on wanted posters and its own floral imagery. From the start, the project was open to all those who got in touch. It is in perhaps in showcasing the kind of full plurality of artistic work and of artists that the archives might help to break the very stigma of who is living with HIV/AIDS. Attesting to the sheer variety of people impacted and the myriad HIV/AIDS experiences and expressions, the collection can expand cultural understandings of the epidemic with due attention to particularity, to connection, to context. It features many of the most acclaimed artists of the 1980s and 1990s in the kind of AIDS art canon, as some folks might call it. Keith Haring, Felix Gonzalez Torres, David Wojnarowicz, Robert Mapplethorpe. It also includes artists like Moore and Dugdale, who were well established but lesser known beyond the kind of art world confines. But what's really unique here is that the project collects the work of artists who may never have made their living as professional artists, who may never have been recognized by the outside world as such. And this is a really kind of unique collection development policy that might mean that the archives can kind of reject or challenge or perhaps reconstitute what the kind of canon of this artwork is. And it can therefore be activated in ways that can disrupt dominant AIDS narratives. The former executive director of Visual AIDS, Nelson Santos, emphasized for me, though, just because it's open to anyone does not mean it provides a more democratic opportunity. Uh, it would be misleading or oblivious, he emphasized, to say it's a complete or a fully equal representation. The Archive Project had and still has race, gender, class, and geographic shortcomings in its representation of AIDS and its activism and cultural production. These are, I argue, deficits in CARE's curatorial reach. These are works and people who remain uncared for, and they are produced and reproduced by the ways in which Visual AIDS was constituted as an organization largely by gay white men. And those kind of foundational biases endure. Santos estimated for me in 2016 that out of the then more than 700 artists who participated in the archive, that less than 100 were artists of color. Over the last decade, Visual AIDS has turned to make a conscious effort to document, to collect, to promote minoritized artists' works. However, further work is needed to actually provide a kind of culturally competent care, to diversify and extend the archive's reach and representation, and therefore the scope of its cure. Providing curatorial care could lead to new forms of material and physical care, mobilizing attention to where care is actually lacking in the contemporary epidemic. I want to talk in one final way about how the archives engages in practices of cure. I take up curing, a form of preservation and activation that ensures the archive's long-term endurance, its accessibility, and its opportunity for critical consumption. Curing bridges the individual structural in response, supporting the aspiration of cure and vibrant life for each individual person, while also assuring the long-term survival of the community as a whole by preserving their works, ideas, and experiences. We knew that there were stories that needed to be preserved and retold, not about victims, but about the universes these artists inhabited. Moore wrote more than 2 years into building the archive project. These records must be preserved, he argued, quote, for their intrinsic value and, quote, for their historic AIDS value. Within a kind of his holistic sense of cure, the processes of curing trace methods used to treat a perishable item so as to prolong its life and to ensure its consumption. In an archival sense, preservation and curation are strategies that materially facilitate now and into the future archival endurance and accessibility. Visual aid's communal approach to curing is in sharp contrast to the medical and pharmaceutical establishment's very limited focus on curing by treating individual patients. Activist archivists work instead towards curing harms that include stigma, hopelessness, isolation, loss of artistic work, breaks in memory transmission, and community breakdown. Records here become tools for individual and collective resilience and empowerment. This approach is crucially strengths-based, supporting and celebrating people who are thriving, not just despite, but even in some cases because of their HIV/AIDS experiences. The archive project, parts of it seen here in Visual Aid's office in Chelsea, includes now more than 25,000 35 millimeter slides, as well as artist statements, exhibition invitations, brochures, catalogs, and other materials. In 2008, Visual Aids developed a strategic plan that called for the creation of a digital archives. Internally and in conversation with its artist members over 18 months, Visual Aids developed guidelines in line with the values of the communities whose lives are implicated in the records. The Digital Artist Plus registry launched in November 2012, and it's meticulous in its commitment to ethically and socially responsible digitization that accounts for the particular privacy, disclosure, and consent concerns that are particularly acute for this community of people living with HIV and AIDS. Curing names those acts that are aimed at preserving and prolonging the life of objects and the information and memories and feelings they hold and provoke for contemporary and future access. And this is a practice of temporal mediation. As the examples I'll talk about in just a moment demonstrate, uh, pro- the visual aids program director, Alex Fiallo, described their kind of their strategy of curing here as, quote, looking back to look forward. And this is a particular kind of programming strategy that I argue is reflective of vital nostalgia. The staff highlighted for me that there has been a recent renewal in public interest, and particularly amongst people of my generation and generations behind me, right, who were not necessarily there to experience these events themselves. But there's this kind of renewal of interest in this kind of period of AIDS cultural production and activism, but it's been largely kind of and it's been nostalgized, but it's been largely contained to this kind of interest in canonical artists and in canonical arts-based activism. Even as visual aids embraces such attention, Fiallo described for me how the organization actively refuses to let its audiences, quote, get stuck in the historical, end quote. It attempts to emphasize through curation the ongoingness and the unequal burdens of the current epidemic on Black, Latinx, and trans communities in particular. Visual aids promotes a dynamic engagement with contemporary social justice movements through its archival activations. For visual aids, social media has become a particularly important kind of tool. Mobilizing the records of the AIDS past on and across Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Vimeo, amongst other platforms, is a means, as Fiallo emphasized for me, of, quote, reminding folks of the current crisis. In its curing, the archives aims to locate and to remember marginalized lives and to invade and to contest their ongoing social subordination. Fialo, who is in charge of visual aids' very active digital presence at the time of my interview, described how he thought considerately and conscientiously about, quote, the fact that if I hashtag Keith Haring, we are going to get 100 new followers. But then if I follow that up with photography by contemporary artists like Kia LaBeija or Jessica Whitbread, that people are going to know about these artists living with HIV as a result of the exposure we get as an organization associated with Haring. A digital slideshow seen here called Radiant Presence, created as the 2015 centerpiece of Visual Aid's annual Day with Art on December 1st, World AIDS Day, illustrates how leveraging nostalgia for the AIDS past on new media recenters the AIDS present. The video was produced collaboratively with 10 curators. Its lead image, an object of much nostalgia, beloved for being, as Fiala described it, sexy, flirty, and fun, is a photograph of a shirtless Keith Haring standing in front of a mural that depicts a shirtless person that spells out the word artist. The face featured here, Haring's, is famous, but the person behind the camera, Juan Manuel Rivera, a Puerto Rican artist member and Haring's former lover, is largely unknown. Quote, when we post it on Facebook or we distribute the program information, the promotion evokes Keith's, Violo articulated, and he knew full well that users would press play because of that photo of Keith. Yet by utilizing a work from an under-recognized artist of color in the collection, it also broadens attention. Viewers were then exposed in a few short moments to 50 other images from the archives. The video circulated digitally, but also projected on buildings from the Guggenheim Museum to the Castro Theater, featured textual interventions too, invoking the current pandemic. It offered contemporary statistics that highlighted issues like rampant HIV criminalization that are particularly relevant to AIDS and arts-based activism now. A key component of the kind of curative process of the Visual AIDS Archive project is the way that they draw contemporary attention to and investment from diverse audiences in the ongoing socio-political importance and differential valences in the lived realities of HIV/AIDS. The archives makes an active and an evolving commitment to curing the acts that constitute a process of holistic cure, one that bridges the individual and the structural, by supporting an aspiration of cure for each artist, while also ensuring the long-term survival of the community as a whole by preserving their artworks, their ideas, their experiences. In November 2018, I flew to New York from Indiana for a 48-hour visit to attend this event, Activating the Archive Project. It happened within a series marking Visual Aid's 30th anniversary, and the event celebrated the archives as one of their most impactful projects. It featured an intergenerational panel facilitated by Visual Aid staffers Kyle Crocs and Tracy Phoenix. It featured Eric Rain, who took that beautiful photograph a few moments ago of John Dugdale, as well as Sir Rodney Sir, Nelson Santos, Charlene Cooper, and David Hirsch. My last minute trip to New York was prompted by seeing Hirsch's name in the announcement. I had been eager to interview Hirsch, the project's sole surviving co-founder, during my fieldwork in 2015 and 2016, but I couldn't find anything, and neither could the organization, about his whereabouts after the mid-1990s. It turns out it was as simple as someone trying a phone number from the 1990s that turned out to still be his, to find him, but that was not something that happened until late 2017. I arranged to meet Hirsch before the event. Even in that first conversation, Hirsch was able to offer tidbits about the archive committee that are now his sole possession. Breaking mid-afternoon and mid-conversation, we agreed to continue, something we would do over the next 6 months. At the panel that night in a rearranged reading room, I sat down in the front among staff, artists, academics, archivists, students. Greetings and chatter in the room quieted as Phoenix posed to the panel and to the audience the event's central questions. First, how can we activate the Visual AIDS Archive project? Second, how have you activated it in the past? And finally, what does it mean for the archive to be an agent of social change and community building and empowerment? We received a handout with the questions printed along with instructions to respond through a drawing, poem, prose, in words. From the start, the archives was conceptualized as vital to a kind of unfolding HIV/AIDS cure, a means to document and stem loss, to offer care, to redress stigma, fear, and other cruelties, to engender survival. As the epidemic and the lived experiences of HIV/AIDS have evolved, so too has the archives. This event, activating the Archive Project, was an occasion to celebrate the archive's past and its present, but true to form, it reached towards its future as well. It emphasized how the archives community holds its responsibility for collectively envisioning the project's future and its archival cure. Something that this kind of continues now. Just last week, I participated in a virtual panel thinking about kind of the particular issues of kind of surveillance uh, and privacy and security in the context of the digital archive. So this kind of cure continues to evolve along with the realities of the world and of the pandemic. And we're living right now in this kind of complicated pandemic moment with these kind of complex results of drug-driven treatment activism that were aimed at medical cure by activists, advocates, researchers, physicians, and people living with AIDS. And the antiretroviral drugs that activists especially help to bring to market are now sold as effective, necessary treatment. And often, and this happens a lot around cure, right? These kind of treatments, though they make HIV, they render it untransmittable, they open up possibilities for long-term survival. They do not actually eliminate the virus in the body, right? But they're still often rounded up to medical cure. Work to eradicate disease appears to drive pharmaceutical development and production, but often in practice, we see saving lives become eclipsed by profit making. Biomedical innovations, right, as I just talked about, render HIV, AIDS sexually non-contagious for those who are on medication and successfully adhering to it. But yet it remains highly stigmatized, and those infected with the virus remain subject to structural and social discrimination, hatred, and fear. Disability scholarship has made clear that even if medical cure for individual patients emerged tomorrow, the history of stigma, violence, and difference cannot and will not be erased as easily. Within a culture steeped in medical cure ideology, there's a deep desire to celebrate HIV/AIDS' defeat already, but we are not actually there, nor are we likely to be anytime soon. Art as a kind of prevention, as a coping mechanism, though laudable, reaches most often a particular audience with educational and class privileges that may not include those put at greatest risk for HIV/AIDS now. Attention from artists and curators has been important, but has repeatedly failed to bring about cure, whether we mean cure in the biomedical, cultural, or political sense. This piece appears only 25 seconds into Radiant Presence, the digital slideshow I talked about a few minutes ago. It's by artist member Shan Kelly. It's titled With Curators Like These, Who Needs a Cure? The work, a 5x7 wood block, is topped with a neat resin varnish that includes the artist's semen and an application of his pubic hair, and it reads, "My AIDS won't fit in your museum." Using semen, a bodily substance that has been deemed dangerous and even deadly in the context of AIDS, Kelly here speaks to how HIV/AIDS is an everyday experience too complex, diverse, and contradictory to be adequately contained in any museum, gallery, or I would argue any archives, or to have its injustices fully redressed by archival or curatorial acts alone. This image lingers for a few moments on the computer screen or on the exteriors of famed museums in which it was projected. Archives and their curative processes cannot, of course, alone end stigma, discrimination, or fear. Yet, even while recognizing their constraints, that does not mean it's worth dismissing kind of the archive's real promise as a resource for anti-AIDS activism. The Archive Project's curative processes, steeped in vital nostalgia, operate on multiple registries: remedy, care, critical caring, and curing. It remedies the artistic death of those impacted by HIV/AIDS by collecting the work. Its acts of care responds to the diverse needs in the moment, and its curing work works towards enabling livable and vibrant lives for individuals while also ensuring through evolving interventions the long-term survival and the thriving of the records community by preserving and making accessible their works, their ideas, and experiences. Overall, the holistic cure proffered by activist archiving is a promising means of acknowledging and redressing structural violences. It's a component of HIV/AIDS cure that is actually within our grasp. And I want to emphasize here, right, that the an archival cure never offers a simplistic or surefire resolution, but instead provides a kind of blueprint towards building different and more just futures. A holistic AIDS cure requires looking backwards as a means to heal and a way to move forward, but one without moving on for impacted communities. Eric Rain, one of the artist participants and early members of the archive committee, argued for me that within the pain held by the documents of disease, there is life. The archives does not aspire, he said, to quote, preserve its collection like it's dead, its history, and it's gone. We're preserving it because there is life and essence there. And if there is no present or future value in the archives, Rain concluded, then we should just bury it and let it rot. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I hope we'll be able to open it for a conversation.